All right, how we doing? Hey, I wanna honor our pastor as well. Can we show him some love too? Like, come on. You know, he's equipping Gen Senders here. He's allowing guys like me to come up here and speak with y'all today. I'm also a little jealous of his shoe game, but just want to honor you today, Pastor Chris. But hey, it's an honor to be with you guys this morning. Like Chris said, my name is Adam. I'm on staff with our Journey Point team, but always love being able to come here and just spend some time with you guys. You guys are awesome here at our downtown Riverside location. And so if you guys, you probably, if you've been around, you probably know we've been in this series of Prepare the Way for a little bit. It's been in our year-long study that we've been calling The Story. And so we are kind of wrapping up our time in the Old Testament. So we're going to do one more week next week in the Old Testament, and then we will be in the New Testament as we've prepared the way now for looking into the life of Jesus. And so I've been encouraged by looking at these Old Testament stories and things like that, and so I hope you guys have as well. And so last week, we were in Nehemiah chapter 6. Pastor Chris talked about how Nehemiah, in the midst of enemies surrounding him, they were kind of in his ear trying to intimidate him on all these things, right? He still was sticking to what God had called him to do. In the midst of those around him trying to sway him from the mission that God had for him, he stuck to it, and he had faith in God above all of that. And so now we're going to pick back up at the end of Nehemiah, and he's going to see just what Jerusalem has been up to since he left them last, where we were last week. And so, spoiler alert, they kind of get things off the rail a little bit, so we'll talk about that today. But in saying that, I'm sure that you have heard this phrase before, or this saying, so I want y'all to say it with me, all right? And it goes like this: when the cat is away, come on, let's go. Y'all know it. When the cat is away, the mice will play. I can think of many times in my childhood where my parents were away and I chose to do maybe the play option instead. They told me certain things, right, that needed to be done around the house, and there were things that I knew that I should probably do, but I veered towards the play version a little bit. I wasn't necessarily like a rule breaker. I was more of like a rule bender. We got any rule benders in the house? Like, come on, right? You can be honest today. I didn't want to break any rules, right? But I wanted to bend the rules a little bit. And so I can think of a time specifically in my life where this scenario kind of came back to bite me. So a little context. I grew up in East Tennessee, and I also grew up in the same house my whole childhood. I had the same dog like my whole childhood growing up. He was a big, borderline overweight, beautiful golden retriever named Murphy, and he lived until he was 16 years old, which is kind of like that's pretty rare for that breed. Side note, like, you can quote me on this, like, golden retrievers, y'all, like, come on, they're the best breed, right? Like, anybody agree with that? Golden retrievers, they're like America's dog, right? 4th of July, you put a bandana on them and there's fire. It's just, I don't make the rules. Like, golden retrievers are the best breed. You can quote me on that. But essentially, those 16 years, Murphy had been with me my whole life. But you also see, Murphy is what was known in the South, what we call an outside dog, or a yard dog, or a farm dog. Now, don't get it twisted, like, don't feel bad for him too much, because unlike Colorado, East Tennessee has these things called yards. Anybody ever heard of them? Right? Kind of few and far between here in our city, but we had these big, beautiful yards in the South, and so this guy had it made, right? He had any stick that he wanted, he could have. He chased squirrels all day long, and then there were areas in our house when it was raining or it was kind of bad weather that he could come into, but there were definitely specific no-no areas for poor Murphy in the house. So, me being the rule bender that I was, I'd feel a little bit bad about him growing up, and I would see him at the door. I'd get home from school like a few hours before my parents would get home, and so I would let him in for like 30 minutes or an hour or so, like let him experience some of the outside life or inside life, you know, and then I'd kick him back out. I thought I was being slick, like I vacuumed the floor. I'd even vacuum the couch, which as a 9-year-old, I don't know how I thought to do that, but I thought I was being slick, right, and letting him in and getting him out before the leaders of the house got home. But there was one day in particular, I was getting in a routine of letting him in a little bit. And so I was going to let him in as usual right after school. And I noticed at like the very last second, all 4 of his paws are just caked in mud. but I had already opened the slide door. And if you know things about golden retrievers, you know that they're pretty hyper dogs. So it was like already over at this moment. And even when I go back to remember it now, like I still see this happening in slow motion. Like I just remember his first paw hitting our rug, and it was just a nice, like perfectly imprinted paw on the rug. And then he directly goes from the kitchen area to our living room, which has like nice white plush carpet. So that was fun. And then I tried to chase him around a little bit, and he thinks it's a game. So he's like juking me out of my shoes. He's like putting me like on my behind a little bit, right? And like I was 9 years old, so I was even more unathletic than I am now. Hard to believe, right? Like I rolled my ankle playing basketball the other week, like Chris said. Like, come on. So my dog was breaking my ankles back then too, you know? And so he thought it was a game, but I finally get him out of the door, and I kid you not, like I go to shut my door, and my dad had decided to come home early that day, and I hear the garage door open like immediately. So needless to say, he was not a fan of the new interior design that I provided with the white carpet and paw prints. But you see, I thought that I was playing this game the right way, right? I thought that it wasn't a big deal that I could play while the leaders of the house were away until it was too late, and I caused an unbelievable mess. And so today we're going to look at what happens when Nehemiah comes back to Jerusalem, and quite honestly, they make a pretty big mess, as we're going to see this morning. You see, Nehemiah leaves them in this flourishing state. He leaves them where like God had worked tremendously, like we talked about last week. But instead of the cat is away line today, I reworded it a little bit for you this morning, and I want us to think on this quote instead, and that is this: when the leader is away, the people will tend to stray. I even let it rhyme like the OG phrase. So like you note takers can thank me for that it still rhymes and is nice and organized there. But when the leader is away, the people will tend to stray. You see, Nehemiah thought that he left Jerusalem in the right hands of capable leaders to continue out in God's mission. But we'll see this morning, they choose inaction instead of action, which is causing these people to stray. And we're going to talk about this theme a lot this morning of inaction versus action. And I just want to remember this truth today. If you don't hear anything else, hear this morning, and that is this: in living the Jesus life, we are called to action as leaders. We're called to action as leaders. Some of you guys are sitting in the chairs today, and that like makes you squirm a little bit because you don't like to be called a leader, and that's a little like that's kind of scary, right? But I think in living the Jesus life, if we said yes to him, we are called to action as leaders. Each one of us have something that he is calling us to. Yet so often, as we'll see in today's passage, it's kind of easy to do the things that we want to do when we are inactive in our faith, when we are inactive in taking the step of leadership, and we're going to see the consequences of that. So turn with me to Nehemiah 13. That is where we'll be today. You can turn with me. You can also pull it up on the QR codes there, and then we'll also have it on the screen for you. But as we are turning there, I just want to dive into a little bit of what happens when we don't take action. And so I've got three kind of reminders this morning for us, or kind of three really warning signs this morning for us when we talk about this theme of inaction. And the first thing is this. The first thing is in action to lead where God has called us to can cause first a compromised commitment. A compromised commitment. I'll show you what I mean, but before we do that, I'm going to pray, and then we will get into the word. So pray with me. Father, you are good. Man, we just thank you so much already for moving this morning. God, for showing up in worship. Thank you for just being with us today, God, as we now dive into your word. Would you speak to us in only a way that you can? Would we get something from your word today, and would we cling to it, God, and cling to you and learn something and take it, God, the rest of this week as we continue to just live on mission for you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, chapter 13, verse 1. You guys ready? If you're ready, say ready. Ready. Let's go. Verse 1, it says this. It says, at that time, the book of Moses was read publicly to the people, and the command was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the Israelites with food and water. Instead, they hired Balaam against them to curse them, but our God turned the curse into a blessing. When they heard the law, they separated all those of mixed descent from Israel, In verse 4, now before this, the priest Eliashib had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of our God, and he was a relative of Tobiah. And he prepared a large room for him where he had previously stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, the tents of grain, new wine, fresh oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, along with the contributions for the priests. And so we learn here from the Old Testament that no Ammonite or Moabite was really supposed to be allowed in the temple without rejecting their other gods first. And that wasn't so that the Israelites could just have this like holy huddle club, right, of only they were allowed to worship the God of Israel. But we see here that the reason for that is because these Ammonites and Moabites tried to curse the Israelites and curse their God. But I love the end of verse 2. It says, God turned that curse into a blessing. Like God's people still prevailed in spite of their enemies cursing them. However, verse 4 comes along and we see, first off, the compromised commitment from Eliashib. It says he allows Tobiah, an Ammonite, to come in and be in the temple, not so that he could worship God, but so that he could advance his own purposes. And if you guys remember last week, Tobiah was actually one of the enemies that was going against Nehemiah. He was one of those people in the ear of Nehemiah trying to intimidate him. So like already this should have been a red flag for Eliashib, right? But he allows Tobiah to come into the temple, and look what happens next in verse 6. It says this. This is key right here. While all this was happening, I was not in Jerusalem. The leader was away, because I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. And it was only later that I asked for the king for a leave of absence, verse 7, so that I could return to Jerusalem. Then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done on behalf of Tobiah by providing him a room in the courts of God's house. Many Bible scholars believe that it was about 10 to 12 years that Nehemiah was gone from Jerusalem. So before he asked the king Artaxerxes for a leave of absence. And you see, Eliashib, I believe here, was relying on the mountaintop experience that Nehemiah brought to the Israelites 10 to 12 years ago, right? He did all these amazing things that we talked about last week. He rebuilt the wall in 52 days. They got the temple back up and running. God's people, the Israelites, were flourishing again, but that was over 10 years prior to this. And mountaintop experiences are great. Like we all love mountaintop experiences, right? But the real test, I believe, comes after the mountaintop. And my question I want to ask us this morning is like, 10 years down the road, 12 years down the road, will we be faithful to what God has called us to? Or will we rely only really on what he has done in the past through other leaders, through other people? God is calling you today, if you have said yes to him, to be a leader. And leadership means that we're always looking forward, that we're not being complacent, and that we're not being inactive, and we are looking to see that the best is yet to come. We choose to believe that as leaders, right? Not that we can just like forget the past, right? Like we must remember God's past faithfulness, but that past faithfulness must spur us on and to believe that his future faithfulness is going to be even better, amen? This is what leaders do. Eliashib failed to do this. He let his convictions fade as well as his commitment. And look at Nehemiah's response, verse 8. He says, I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household's possessions out the room. I kind of read this and just laugh. Like I can see Nehemiah just throwing one thing after the other out, right? Anybody ever watch like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air? Like, yeah, come on, we got a few. Like I grew up watching that. There's a scene where Uncle Phil always like throws out Jazz, who was Will Smith's best friend in that. Like I can just see Nehemiah like starting to toss things out the door, and then he like looks over and sees Tobiah, and he just grabs him as well and throws him out too. Like I just imagine that when I read verse 8. But read with me again in verse 9, continuing on. It says this. It says, I ordered that the rooms be purified and the articles of the house of God restored there, along with the grain offering and frankincense. And so here we see, I love this, by the way, but here we see Nehemiah do something similar to what Jesus does in the temple in the New Testament. We see Jesus do the same kind of thing by flipping the tables of the Pharisees, right, that were using the temple for their own gain. And I love the parallels here between Nehemiah and Jesus, as we're going to look at in the New Testament in just a few short weeks. Like they're both cleaning out the house of God again, right? They're cleaning it back up and they're restoring it to glory, to glorify God. This is an action that both Nehemiah takes here and what Jesus will take in the future. You see, leaders do not let things go by that they know is not honoring to God. Like Nehemiah could have been inactive here. He could have let this moment pass him by. He could have brought Elisha to the side and started the conversation like, hey man, so I noticed Tobiah was kind of living here and not honoring God. And he actually put a lot of things that were honoring to God in other rooms. They should be in here. I don't know, could you talk to him maybe? He could have done that, right? He could have skirted around the problem at hand, but he takes action. He's not inactive, and this is a love for God to bring honor back into his house. Church, a question I want to ask us today is, in our lives here in 2022, what things are we just letting pass us by when we know that they are not right, or we know that they are not honoring to God? Because failure to act, to do what is right in the midst of injustice or in the midst of wrongdoings or in the midst of things that are not honoring to God is just as bad as when we actively commit other sins, right? We talked about it last week. We have the sin of omission and the sin of commission, right? Failure to act, to do what is right when we know deep down we should do something is a sin of omission. Nehemiah does not take that action, though. He steps up here and he takes action to set things right. His commitment was not compromised. But that doesn't end here in this chapter. We got a lot more of Nehemiah 13 that we need to read, and we see a lot more where the Israelites are falling short. So he's just going from one thing, really cleaning up one thing to the next thing. So that leads me to my second point today, and that is this. An action to lead where God has called us to can cause, secondly, misplaced priorities. Misplaced priorities. At first, can lead to a compromised commitment, and the second thing is that it can lead to misplaced priorities. I'll show you what I mean. Look at the next few verses. Verse 10 says this. It says, I also found out that because the portions for the Levites had not been given, each of the Levites and the singers performing the service had gone back to his own field. Therefore, I rebuked the officials, asking, why has the house of God been neglected? I gathered the Levites and singers there and stationed them at their post. Verse 12, and then all Judah brought a tenth of the grain, new wine, and fresh oil into the storehouses. And so we see here now that the people are misplacing their priorities by not giving back to God what is his, by neglecting the people in the temple, by giving back to the temple. And it says because of this, the singers, the Levites, those who were serving in the temple, they weren't even showing up anymore. And Nehemiah is like, hey, guys, what's going on? The house of God is fully being neglected here. It's fully being forsaken. And here's the deal. It's always kind of awkward to get on stage and talk about giving or finances or things like that. But I just want to remind you first off of just this truth today. And it's something that we say all the time, but it's really true. When you give to Riverside, when you give to the church, you are giving through Riverside. You are giving through the church. We're able to be for our city because of the faithful resources and time and effort that you give to our church. So hear that today and hear our heart behind that. When we talk about giving and we talk about faithfulness, right? We cannot do any of what we do without your faithfulness. But I think this chapter kind of shows us right here what happens when the house of God can get neglected. And so we can learn from Nehemiah 13 right here in the misplaced priorities of these Israelites. And we see the result of what happens when God's people fail to give back to what he is doing. And the root issue of it all is also not that they just weren't giving. God can still move in Israel here despite their giving or not, right? God can still move in our city and in our church whether or not we provide anything, right? But the root issues here was that their priorities were mixed up. They had misplaced priorities. Because of their inaction to lead out and put God first, they get complacent and they wanted to spend their time and effort and resources doing other things. Now, that's not to say that they were supposed to spend all day, every day, 24/7 in the temple, right? We're not asking that here today either. If you spend all day, every day, 24/7 right here in this room, that'd be kind of weird. Middle of the week, the lights are off and you'd be in here alone. So we're not saying that, right? But we can learn the lesson here that the little they did start to stop giving got into nothing. And the house of God was neglected. In church, we must not let the work that God is doing through our church be neglected. We must act together and we must link arms with one another. If we want to see this city reached, if we want to see our neighborhood of Jeff Park be reached, we must link arms and we must act together. It cannot rely on one leader or on one person. So ask yourself this morning, whatever it looks like for you, whether it's time or resources or effort, ask yourself this morning, where do my priorities lie? Where am I placing my priorities? Where can I maybe plug in more to the life of the church? Whether that's groups or in connect groups or core groups or serving in ministries or volunteering or whatever it is, right? Ask yourself where your priorities lie and where you can maybe plug in more today. I want to challenge you today with this truth as well, and that is this. Priorities reflect the passions of a leader. Priorities reflect the passions of the leader. So you tell me what you're passionate about, and as time goes on, I can probably see where your priorities lie, right? So case in point, I love and have a passion for the game of golf. I wish I was better at it sometimes, but that's beyond the point, right? I love and have a passion for golf, right? And so like any golfer does, I'm always thinking of ways to decrease my strokes, right? To get a lower score. And I know one easy way to do that is to get better at putting. They say it in golf all the time. They say you drive for show and you putt for dough, right? So I have a passion for golf and want to get better at it and want to lower my score. But here's the deal. I hate practicing putting. It's so boring, right? If I'm going to the driving range, I just want to hit driver all day long and do all these things, right? I don't want to sit on a putting green for a couple hours and just sit there and putt. That is so boring to me. But you know what? Because I have a passion for golf, I'm going to prioritize practicing on the putting green because I know if I do that, it's going to lower my score. Priorities reflect the passions of a leader. What you are passionate about, you will prioritize, whatever it may be. And God has placed in you passions and desires to use you and to make his name known. As we as a church want to come alongside you and we want to help you grow in those passions as we prioritize the kingdom work. Nehemiah was passionate about getting things back right for the house of God. He takes actions as a leader here and he prioritizes giving again. I love this. In verse 13, it says this. It says, I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses the priest Shelemiah, the scribe Zadok, and Pedaiah of the Levites, with Hanan, son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, to assist them, because they were considered trustworthy. They were responsible now for the distribution to their colleagues. I love this verse because it shows that Nehemiah is learning here as a leader. It says that he starts to empower others to make sure that the job gets done. It says these people are trustworthy people whose priorities are aligned with Nehemiah, and most importantly, people whose priorities are aligned with God. And in the midst of Nehemiah 13, we're only halfway through, so bear with me. He's going to have to fix a lot more problems. But in the midst of fixing these problems, Nehemiah could have had the attitude of man, 10 to 12 years ago, I was the man. I was killing it. This is what Jerusalem was like when I was here. And so here I am again, just fixing everybody's problems. Let me be the guy to step up always, right? But he's learning here by equipping these people and empowering them to be trustworthy and to ensure that the house of God is not neglected again. But we see misplaced priorities come up again in the life of the Israelites, first with giving, and then second, look with me here at the next part in verse 15. Their priorities are mixed up yet again. It says this. It says at verse 15, at that time, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and they were also bringing in stores of grain and loading them on donkeys along with wine, grapes, and figs. And all kinds of goods were being brought to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I warned them against selling the food on that day. And then we're going to skip ahead to verse 17. It says this, I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil that you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same so that our God brought all this disaster on us and on this city? And now you are rekindling his anger against Israel by profaning the Sabbath. These again are misplaced priorities by the Israelites, first with giving and now with neglecting the Sabbath. And moment of transparency here, this is something that I have to check myself on so often. It's so hard sometimes to turn it off, right? It's so hard to not be consumed with the work that God is calling us to do. And we may have different ways in which we Sabbath now as opposed to the rules set up in the Old Testament. But understand this, like God still calls us to faithfully rest in him in whatever capacity that looks like. I can't tell you how important it is to Sabbath regularly. And the intent of Sabbath is to remind us of where our priorities lie. And here's the deal. I love my job so much. I love serving our Journey Point community over in Central Park. I love working and serving alongside of you here in our downtown community as well. I love this job. It's the best job I've ever had, and I'm so blessed every single day to be able to do what I do. But if I can't turn it off, like if I can't rest in the provisions that God has for me and be reminded that it is he who provided me with all these things and all this great work that I have, then I don't love this church as much as I say I do. Because the best thing that I can do in my job as a staff member serving alongside of you and walking with you is to rely on God and his provisions and to listen to him when he says something like Sabbathing is important, right? Like Sabbath is all across the Bible. From Genesis on, God talks about Sabbathing. So if it is important to God, it should be important to us when he says something like Sabbathing is important. Don't let the tasks that God or the work that God has called you to consume you, because he's placed you where you are, yes, for a reason in your line of work. But if you let it consume you, then two things are going to happen. A, you're not going to be as effective in that job. You're going to be burnt out. You're going to not want to be there all the time, right? And B, you're going to end up prioritizing that job over God himself who gave you that job. Don't let your line of work consume you. Be grateful for what God has given you, but rest in him. The New Testament shows us we're not under the same law maybe that the Israelites are, but we do have the same obligation to honor God above making money, above investing in the jobs that he's provided for us, above working all the time. We have to honor God above those things. Ask yourself where your priorities lie. Ask yourself if you're investing in other trustworthy people to commit in the kingdom work with you. Ask yourself if you are regularly resting in who God is. And if your answer to that question is, you know what? Like I'm not really investing in others like I should. Or you know what? Hey, I'm not really resting in God as often as I probably need to. Understand that like that's okay. That's a good space to be because you're being honest, right? It's okay when we find ourselves answering those questions like that, but we must take action when we find ourselves here. Because here's the deal. Like leaders aren't leaders because they're perfect, right? Leaders aren't leaders because they never fall, but leaders are leaders because they get back up when they fall. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when leaders fall, they get back up and they take action to start to look more and more like Jesus. Nehemiah takes action yet again. Verse 19, in dealing with these people Sabbathing or not Sabbathing, he says this. It says, when the shadows began to fall on the city gates of Jerusalem just before the Sabbath, I gave orders that the city gates be closed and not opened until after the Sabbath. I posted some of my men at the gates so that no good could enter during the Sabbath day. And once or twice, the merchants and those who sell all kinds of goods camped outside Jerusalem. But I warned them, why are you camping in front of the wall? If you do it again, I'll use force against you. In some other translations I was reading this week, he says, I will lay hands on you. I don't think that's the hands that you and I want to be laid on for us, right? I think he means a little something different than praying over them. But he goes on to say this, after that, they did not come again on the Sabbath. Verse 22, then I instructed the Levites to purify themselves and guard the city gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. This emphasizes yet again the priorities that Nehemiah had. And in his failure to lead out 10 years before, he gets back up and he takes action to now make it right. Last truth for you this morning. An action to lead where God has called us to can cause a compromised commitment. It can cause misplaced priorities. And lastly, it can cause a slippery slope to sin. A slippery slope to sin. At the end of this chapter, we see the Israelites, spoiler alert, shocking, right? Stumbling yet again. And in the years that Nehemiah was gone, they began to marry other people from pagan nations that surrounded their land. And this necessarily wasn't, not just because these people were like not Israelites, right? But it was because it says that these pagan nations were actively against God and actively against Israel, similarly to how Tobiah was at the beginning of the chapter. And Nehemiah even alludes to this, and he talks about how this even brings King Solomon down. He says this in verse 26. He says, "Didn't King Solomon of Israel sin in matters like this? There was not a king like him among many nations. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. And yet foreign women drew him in to sin." Again, Nehemiah isn't saying here that like Solomon marrying the foreign women is a sin necessarily, but he is saying that because he married them, things happened, a slippery slope happened, and they began to draw him in to sin. Now, we don't have a vow like the Israelites do anymore to marry only people in our own nation, right? But there are things in our lives that I believe are slippery slopes to sin. And as leaders, as followers of Jesus, we must be aware of those trigger temptations that happen in our lives. Because no matter what we go through in this life, we all are tempted with something. Even Jesus was tempted with something. And so the best illustration I've heard on how the enemy uses temptations in our lives and how he uses the slippery slope to sin in our lives is this. Think of a lion hunting its prey, right? Really started strong there. It's kind of graphic, right? But think of a lion hunting its prey, right? A lion really just needs a toehold to get into poor Bambi. But that toehold, you're thinking, well, they can still squeeze out of it maybe. But a lion's claws are pretty sharp, people. I don't know if you knew this, but a lion's claws are pretty sharp. So that toehold slowly starts to maybe become a paw hold. And then a lion is so much stronger than whatever it's hunting. It's so much faster. It's so much bigger. Its claws are so much sharper that before that prey knows it, that paw hold goes to the mouth of the lion being around the prey's neck. It goes from a toe hold to a paw hold and to fully grasped in the lion's neck. That's a graphic illustration, I know. So you know what? I did you a favor today. I decided not to show that on the screen, so you're welcome for that. But understand that this is how the enemy uses sin in our lives. It just starts small. Just the toe hold, right? Just one or two clicks on the image that I probably shouldn't click on because I know it might take me to a website that I deep down don't really want to go to. Just maybe one or two drinks out on the town with somebody, but I know I've had a history of that, and so I need to watch it, but they're inviting me, and I got work tomorrow, but just one or two drinks will never hurt. Just one or two little bets on the big game. I've had issues with that before and money issues, and maybe you're struggling with something like that, but hey, it's the Super Bowl, right? It's the big game. I've got to place just a couple of bets on that. Just the toehold is how it starts. And then before we know it, those things turn to paw holds. And then before we know it, we are fully caught in the grasp of sin. Be aware of the slippery slopes to sin in your life. Be aware of the temptations that you face as leaders. But remember, the good news in all of it today is when we fall, not if we fall, but when we fall, because of God's grace, we can get back up. More importantly, because of God's grace, he picks us back up, even when we can't pick ourselves up, and we can take action to slowly look more and more like Jesus. I can't tell you how thankful I am that God has picked me up and allowed me to take an action step to start to look more like him, because you name the toehold sins that go on in this world, and I'm right there guilty of pretty much all of them. But you see, the good news today in all of this is that God keeps his promises that we could never keep. And so when God promises us, if we trust in him and have a faith in him, he promises us that through him and him alone, we can experience a relationship with Jesus like no other. God keeps the promises that we could never keep on our own. He's a promise maker and he's a promise keeper. And it's ironic because all of the ways in which the Israelites fall short in this chapter, actually in previous chapters of Nehemiah, they vow to not do any of those things that we just talked about today. I'll prove it real quick. It says this. In Nehemiah 10:39, a few chapters before, the people promised and said this: "We will not neglect the house of our God." And yet, we see because it was neglected, invaders like Tobiah took over the temple. Verse 32, a little bit before in Nehemiah 10, says this: The people promise to give back. They say, we will impose the following commands on ourselves: to give 1/8 of an ounce of silver yearly for the service of the house of our God. And yet, they fail to do that. Nehemiah 10:31. The Israelites vowed to never buy or sell anything on the Sabbath, and yet Nehemiah finds them doing just that. And lastly, in Nehemiah 10:30, we see that the Israelites vow to not give their daughters to the surrounding people groups in marriage, and yet later on, we see them now married to those that are actively against God. Guys, we cannot keep so many promises that we try to make. Because if we could keep every single promise ever, and if we could go and be 100% on our word, then Jesus' death on the cross would have been for nothing, right? We must remember that it is only Jesus who saves. Not a law, not our own word, not any promises that we can or cannot keep, not any box that we can check by doing the right things. This is not a relationship with Jesus. This is not what a relationship with Jesus looks like. A relationship with Jesus looks like in Romans 8:3. It says this. Paul says, for what the law could not do, since it was weakened by the flesh, God did. He condemned sin in the flesh by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh as a sin offering, so that those could walk not in the flesh, but in the Spirit. Jesus and Jesus alone is the only one who can keep all of his promises to you and to me. This is the good news this morning. Nehemiah 13 is kind of a heavy chapter. It's kind of a heavy chapter because it peels back really just how much we fall short as humans in this life. Just how easy it can be for us to fail as leaders, but we can have a hope in Jesus this morning by believing that everything he says he will do, he does. Everything that Jesus tells us he will do, he does. And because of that, we can stand up, we can take action, and we can slowly start to look more like him. I said it earlier, but yeah, Nehemiah 13 is kind of a heavy chapter, so I just want to encourage you with three truths this morning as we close out and as the band and Ethan and the team start to come back up. But just three quick truths for you this morning in the midst of Nehemiah 13. And the three truths are this. Because of Jesus, we can freely walk into what he has called us to. First off, by remembering that God fulfills the promises that we can't. We just talked about it, right? God fulfills the promises that we can't. We can also walk freely in Jesus. Secondly, because we are free to fail as long as we get back up. We're free to fail. We're free to fall short. We're free to not be perfect. That's okay as long as we get back up. Or even more so, as long as we remember that it is God that picks us back up. We are free to fall, but we must continue to try and do our best to look more and more like Jesus every single day. And then thirdly, because of the freedom in Jesus, I believe this is something that fires me up right here. The time to step up is now. I fully believe that the time to step up is now. You and I each have a choice of if we will step up to the task that God has called us to. Sometimes that's daunting and sometimes that feels like a really big task, right? But like Pastor Chris said last week, like sometimes the task feels big, but we have a God that is even bigger than that task. And so my question for you today is that in this season, will you step up? Because this is a season for us to step up as believers. Right now, in our current climate and in this cultural moment, we have the opportunity as believers to step up and show the love of God to our neighbors, to our community, to our city, to our country, and to our world. Let's step up. Let's not be inactive, and let's take action to what God has called us to. And if you're in the room today and you haven't said yes to Jesus, or you're still processing your thoughts on this whole Jesus thing, I just want to encourage you with this today. That Jesus loves you more than you will ever know. And in the times that you fall, not if, but when you fall, he will always be there to pick you back up if you have said yes to him. You can trust in Jesus today and in his perfection and in his glory and in his might, not of anything that you can do. And this beautiful picture starts to be painted as when we say yes to him, we start to look more like him. Yes, we'll fall short sometimes, but that's okay because he picks us back up. As long as we are taking active steps in our faith, we can have a hope in him and we can rest in him. If for the first time today you want to say yes to Jesus, you can just simply text all one word, I said yes, to 720-780-6969. We say it often, that's not a magic number, right? But what it is a message to one of our team members saying the biggest commitment that you just made in your life and the best commitment that you just made in your life. And when we receive that message, man, we walk with you every step of the way on this new journey. I want to encourage you today. If you've never said yes to Jesus and you want to today, text those words to that number. So in just a moment, we're going to respond again with worship. But before we do, I just want us to sit in this moment. And I want us to ask ourselves one final question. I know I've been asking a lot of questions of y'all today. But I want to ask us one question, and that is this. Ask yourself, what is something that I must do to step up for God in the kingdom? What is something that you must do to step up for God in the kingdom? To say, you know what, God, I'm not going to allow this just to pass me by anymore. I'm not going to sit and not do what is right when I know that it is the right thing to do. I must step up for you and the kingdom. Ask yourself this question. Take a few moments, think about it, and then I will pray and we will get back into worship.